Tonight is definitely going to be more of a Christmas type message, but this one, in a way, I guess you could say is a Christmas message. But if you're reading the title in the back of your handout, you may be wondering what in the world the Valley of Bellevue is. Well, we'll try to see what that is, but I want to begin by talking about cell phones. Cell phones is something you either love or hate, right? But of all the technological advancements of the modern era, I don't think anything's come farther than phones in general. What originally began, think about this, as a simple device able to just send like a Morse code, beeps, has now become something that has revolutionized our life. It connects people across the world. It's a handheld computer, if you have a smartphone, capable of doing pretty much everything imaginable. The world is quite literally at our fingertips or in our pockets as we walk around. This wasn't what I was going to talk about, but this past week, I don't know if you heard, California now said that the radiation from cell phones in your pockets may be detrimental to your health. It may be detrimental to more than that, but it's changed the world around us, right? It's changed the way that we communicate with each other. We can now, if we want to get in contact with somebody, used to, you would call somebody if they weren't at home. That was it. That was the end of it, right? Especially before answering machines. They never knew you called. There was no proof that you ever called. And if you weren't at home, you didn't know that they called. But today, if you want to get into contact with somebody, you can text them, you can call them, you can email them, you can contact them on Facebook, Instant Messenger, whatever social media outlet that you want, or even have a video conference with them from around the world, any place in the world. What we're able to do as humans in today's world is pretty extraordinary if you think about it. But even though we've advanced such a long way, even though we can communicate with satellites traveling in the furthest reaches of our solar system at least, there's one thing in our modern world we've still yet to eliminate, and that's a bad connection, right? How many have ever had a bad cell phone connection? So I'm not talking about a bad connection that you have with somebody, although that hasn't been eliminated either. I'm talking about dead spots, places like Bellevue, Texas. Now, how many people know where Bellevue is? So it's infamous for two things. I'm glad that you know what I'm talking about. We went through there twice yesterday. And if you are from Bellevue or you know somebody that's from Bellevue, I apologize. Not for what I'm about to say, but because you're from Bellevue, Texas. But for those of you that don't know where Bellevue, Texas is, you're not alone because apparently the cell phone providers have never heard of the place either. But it is a very small city on 287 on the way to the Metroplex as you're on your way to Fort Worth. And it's known for two things in particular. First, it's known as that place where you slow down to 55, if you know what I'm talking about. Because if you don't know, it's a well-known speed trap, and if you say, oh, I've never got a ticket there, your day of reckoning is coming. Sooner or later, it will come. So it's known as that place you slow down at. But as I said earlier, it's also infamous for something else, and that's the bad cell phone reception. In fact, if I happen to be coming upon Bellevue, I usually give people a heads up. Hey, I'm about to head through the Valley of Bellevue, so if I lose you, you know what happens. It's a valley so deep, so treacherous, that no cell phone signal has ever escaped. But I know I'm being a little over the top, but it's something we've all faced, whether it was in Bellevue, Texas, or some other place. We've all had that drop call at the most inopportune moment, isn't it? It's always at the most inopportune moment. When you ask somebody or when somebody asks you like a dynamic, life-changing question, you're about to give the most eloquent response. For some reason, you just perfectly have the words. And you're about to give the most eloquent response you've ever given in your life, only to realize, hello? The only person you're talking to is yourself, and you can't remember what you said to save your life. And the worst part is you have no idea where along the conversation. Me and John Self have this all the time. And he might think I'm making it up. But every time he calls me or I call him, my cell phone just quits working. I don't know what it is. But it sounds funny, but it always happens, doesn't it? Either he's talking and I can't hear him, or I'm talking and he can't hear me. But you have no idea at what point in the conversation it actually quit working, right? So you don't even know where to pick it up. But it's something we've all experienced. That aggravation of a dropped call, that bad connection where every other word is audible and you're trying to put the pieces together. We've all faced a valley of Bellevue, haven't we? At least when it comes to cell phones. But have you ever wondered if something like that happens between us and God? Are there things in our lives, are there things standing in our way that either distort the signal of communication between us and God or cut it off completely? I think there is. I think we live in a world that's filled with those things that distort His voice, that distort His will, until we finally reach the point where it seems like we're only talking to ourselves and there's no one else on the other line. Well, that's precisely what I want to consider today as we look at 1 Samuel chapter 23, beginning in verse 1. You didn't know it was about cell phone signal, did you? In a sermon I've entitled, Walking Through the Valley of Bellevue, a play on the words that David says, some of the most famous words that David speaks as I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, a situation that was written when he was going through this time with Saul, which is kind of interesting. And we're going to look at it in three moves this morning: a distorted signal, a broken connection, and a divine call. So let's begin by looking at our first point this morning, a distorted signal. So as we pick up the story today in 1 Samuel chapter 23, we find that little has changed. As you're reading through this on your own, or if you're reading through it in a yearly Bible reading, you're like, okay, same story, different day, right? Nothing has changed in David's life. But if you think that, reading through 1 Samuel, just imagine what David must have been thinking as he continued to go through this time of distress. He's still a wanted man. He's still being relentlessly pursued by Saul. He's still an outcast and a refugee among his own people, his own nation, a nation that he's called to rule, a nation that he's called to be king over. In the life of David, his family, and every man around him is in constant danger because of Saul. But as we arrive in verse 1, we find that there was another pressing threat, another pressing reality that had captured David's attention, and that was the ever-constant menace known as the Philistines, right? Who, believe it or not, I don't know if you can imagine this, didn't care about Saul and David's confrontation. They didn't care about this ongoing feud, because the enemy doesn't care if we're going through a hard time, right? I know that's hard to process, but in fact, it's something the enemy tries to use to their own advantage, and that's exactly what the Philistines were doing here. They're going to milk this confrontation, this ongoing feud, for all it's worth, because they know something that still is true today as it was 3,000 years ago when this happened: a people that are divided or a people that are weak. And that's the truth even behind our own nation. So we read in verse 1, now they, and even though we're not told exactly who they are, but these people, whoever they are, continue, they're that guy, I guess. These people continue to pop up even though they're never named. David's informants, Saul's informants, they really, who David and Saul have an endless supply, tell David, behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors. When I thought of that, it sounds so familiar to Keilah, you know. Maybe that's where they got it from. Who knows? Therefore, David inquired of the Lord. So as David receives this news, don't miss this, without a moment's hesitation, without even blinking an eye, he immediately turns to God in prayer. I think that says a lot about David. For him, it's not even a question. It's not even something to be considered. When he needed an answer, the very first thing that he does is seek God's will and seek God's way. And so should it be with us. That's the very first thing that we should always do, and yet, quite often, that's the very last thing that we choose to do. So we read in verse 2 that David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack these Philistines? The obvious answer is yes, right? Does he even have to ask? And I think that's the point the text is trying to make. And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. So he asked God a very simple and straightforward answer. I wish it always happened like this, but there may be a reason it doesn't. But in return, he's given a very straightforward and simple response. Yes, go, pursue the Philistines, and save Keilah. So he tells him to go and do what David already knows is his obligation and his duty as king, and defend the nation that God has called him to rule. See, just because the circumstances of our lives change, it doesn't mean that God's word changes, right? Just because the circumstances of our lives look different doesn't mean what God has called us to do is changed or looks different. In other words, we have no excuse, no matter what we're going through, to not do what God has called us to do. But I'll let that rest for now, for something even bigger happens in this text, something even more significant. We read in verse 3 that despite what God had already told David to do. Now David here and Saul are a direct contrast, right, throughout this story. But David here does something that each of us have done. Despite what God had already told him to do, couldn't have been clearer, couldn't have been plainer. We read in verse 3 that the men of David say to him, behold, we are afraid. They start every sentence with behold. They want them to know they're about to say something, I guess. In Hebrew, hine, get someone's attention. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Then don't miss this. So they bring their request, their objection, if you will, before David. And David inquired of the Lord again. Not because it wasn't clear the first time, but because once again he had things that were distorting the signal, if you will, the will of God in his life. It's almost funny if you think about it, and I think that's the way Samuel's trying to present it. God gives David a clear, concise, straightforward answer. Go out, pursue the Philistines, save Keilah. So David goes to his men and says, all right, men, I know we're in a tight spot. I know Saul is still pursuing us. I know we're in danger constantly. But God told me we need to go save Keilah. That's what we're called to do. After all, despite Saul, it's still God's promised land. It's still God's promised people. But as soon as the men show the slightest air of hesitation, right? As soon as the men sow the tiniest seed of doubt in David's mind, there David is once again seeking the Lord in prayer. Hey, God, can you identify with that? I know what you just told me 5 minutes ago, right? But the men, they're not so sure, They think that we're putting ourselves in even more danger. So I just wanted to make sure a second time. It was a yes on saving Keilah, on saving the people, right? The reception way out here isn't so great. My ephod doesn't pick up everything that I need to pick up. I was going to just leave that reference to see if you understood or were paying attention. But do you know how David contacts God in this passage? He gets the ephod, the sign of God's signal. So maybe the signal on his ephod wasn't quite working. Shouldn't have to. If they always said if you have to explain the joke, it's not a good joke. I don't know. I guess it's not a good joke. But this time, in verse 4, kind of the second half of the verse, look at what God says. God's constantly gracious and compassionate to us. He doesn't say, David, I already told you once. He says, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. Not only go and save Keilah, but I'm going to be with you every step of the way. It's an amazing story because I think it so beautifully illustrates the truth of our own lives, the truth of what I'm calling the distorted signal. See, here we find David, in spite of his sworn duty to protect the people of Israel, something he's been doing ever since the time he was young, something he's been doing ever since he fought Goliath, right, as a young man. In spite of the obvious truth, David still goes before God on two separate occasions, but more importantly in this story, it's the reason why he goes before God on both occasions. The first time is because the circumstances of his life distorted the signal, the will of God, what God wanted him to do. And the second time, now this never happens to us, but it was because the people in his life distorted the signal and what God wanted him to do. And what a powerful truth for us. See, there's so many things in this life that can distort His Word, that can distort His truth, that can distort His will. So many excuses we give to others and we give to God. It can be the media. It can be the things that we listen to. It can be the things that we read online, the TV shows that we watch. It can be the people around us. Dare I say, it could even be the sin, the unbelief in our own hearts. So many things can distort the voice of God in our lives, but here we find, despite them all, God's Word and God's truth stays the same. And that's the truth for us as the church. It doesn't matter what the culture believes. It doesn't matter what you read on Facebook or in the news, what people assume is the truth in this culturally relative society. God's truth never changes. God's truth remains the same, and God's call for us remains the same. It reminds me of the words that God told Micah, one of my favorite passages in all the Bible. I bring this up as often as I can. You probably already know what it's going to be. But Micah 6:8, it's so simple, it's so straightforward as Micah tells the people, hey, you may be going through captivity, that your world may not look the way you think it should, but in spite of it all, He's told you what you should do. He's told you, oh man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? Something that's unreasonable, something that you could never do? No. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. And that's precisely what He desires for us today. What God has called us to do, it's not an unreasonable request. And just like David, He's not only promised us that we're going to have ultimate success, even though we may have some failures along the way, but He's promised us that He's going to be with us every step of the way, right? He's never going to leave us or forsake us. He will be with us even until the end of the age. We just need to have ears that are willing to hear, open, and willing to hear what He's saying to us, and hearts that are willing to receive it in our lives, in the midst of all the distortions of this world. And that brings us to our second point, a broken connection. So as we continue through and we kind of move into the second part of this passage, we encounter a second reality that in pretty much every way is infinitely worse than the first. Unfortunately, it's also the reality of our world today, not only for Saul, but for us, the reality of what I'm calling a broken connection. As we fast forward in the story to verse 7, we find that once again, Saul gets news of David's location. I love this. We read in verse 7, now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah. No mention of who it is. Maybe this guy didn't want to die, so he always was an anonymous source. But it's no surprise here. Saul once again has an informant that knows precisely where David was. Can you imagine if law enforcement today had these kind of informants? They always know where the criminals are, right? And they always know exactly what's happening. But once again, this unnamed informant, which could have been the same guy going back and forth. Hey, David's over here. Give me some money. Hey, Saul's over here. Give me some money. Who knows what's happening here? But as soon as he hears that David is in a fortified city, I love the irony of this passage. In other words, a city that was surrounded by high walls with only one way or only a couple ways to go in and only a couple ways to come out. Look at what Saul says in verse 7. God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. See, he sees it as an imprisonment. And what an intriguing statement if you really think about it. A verse like so many we've come across in 1 Samuel that's filled with irony and multiple meanings, duality. First, we have the irony of the setting. Consider this. A city that can easily be viewed from two perspectives. You have the perspective of the insiders and you have the perspective of the outsiders. From those within the city, how is the city seen? The safety net, right? A world that's protected from the world around it, in which you can live your own little lives protected from everything else. But from the outside perspective, it's seen quite differently. It's seen as a prison. In fact, in Saul's own words, those very same walls that kept them safe from invaders could trap them inside and imprison them. Is that the reality of the church or what? I don't know. It's all depending on how you're looking at it, right? The same walls that protect us can imprison us and keep us from doing what we need to be doing. So first, we kind of have the duality of the location, an irony that's only compounded by Saul's own words here. For think about this. Despite being obviously rejected as king, despite being told by Samuel, the man that anointed him, the kingmaker, that God has rejected you and He's chosen another that's going to be king, and despite the obvious fact, beyond all reasonable doubt, that David was God's chosen king, when Saul learns that David is in Keilah, he's so blinded to the truth of God, his heart has become so hardened that he honestly believes of all things that God has delivered David into his hand. Can you imagine that? What a painful truth for the world in which we live today. A world and a culture that's so hardened to the truth of God, that's the living embodiment of what the Scriptures predicted, that they would call evil good and they would call good evil. They can't even realize how lost they truly are. But church, I have news for them and I have news for you. It's not always pleasant news, and it shouldn't even be news at all, really. But the day of reckoning is coming. And that's why we preach, and that's why we live every day. We don't live in the light of the circumstances of our lives, but in the light of the circumstances of the end. But the day of reckoning is coming, just as the prophets of old predicted, but the people wouldn't listen, just as Noah predicted, but the people wouldn't listen. Just like Samuel told Saul, but Saul couldn't accept. One day Jesus is going to come again. But on that day, He's not going to come like He came the first time. On that day, He's not going to come as an innocent lamb born in a manger to save the world. He came that way. But on the second day, He's going to come like a lion, riding on a white horse with a sword in His hand. And on that day, we read that He's going to right every wrong, that He's going to vanquish every foe, that He's going to establish His kingdom, a perfect kingdom. And whether or not it's something that the culture or the world will accept, the truth remains the same. As the old saying goes, the truth abideth still, right? And on that day, there's only going to be one way to escape the judgment. There's only going to be one way to escape that day of reckoning, and it's going to be found in Jesus and Jesus alone. It's going to be found by setting aside our own will, our own way, what we want and what we want to do, by setting aside our own sense of morality, of right and wrong, which has been so blinded and so distorted by this world around us, and giving our hearts and our lives all of who we are and all that we have for Him and for His great name. That's how we find true peace in this life. That's how we find a hope that's unfading. And that's how we reestablish the connection that's been broken and distorted by this world, by making Jesus the Lord of our lives once again. And that brings us to our final point, a divine call. So, as we look at this passage, we find there's so many things that can distort His will. There's so many things that can keep us from walking in obedience to His word. Sometimes it's because, like David, the circumstances of our lives and the people in our lives distort His word and His will. Other times it's because, like Saul, we've become so hardened to the truth, to the voice of God, that we can no longer hear it at all. But this morning, as we gather in His house on this day before Christmas, a day which celebrates God becoming man to not only show us a better way, but to provide that way through His death, I can't think of a better time and a better season for us to take just a moment. Can we do that on Sunday, Christmas Eve? And stop and listen for His voice in our hearts. So as we come to our time of invitation this morning, that's precisely what I want us to do. Take just a brief moment, a short time to listen to His voice, to reestablish the connection that's broken and distorted by all the things in this world, and to see what He might have us to do with our lives, with the things that are standing in the way, whether it's people, whether it's sin, whether it's those things we're unwilling to let go of. And just hand them all over to Him and say, God, you know what, on this day, I want everything that's separating us to be removed so that I can hear your voice once again in my life and so that I can know your will for my future. If you would, please stand and let's go to the Lord in prayer.